Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Rainieris, and I'm the founding director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab, as well as a professor of the practice here at Notre Dame. I'm very happy to welcome you to this Idea Week session on how to scale your business ethically and responsibly while still making a profit. In this session, we will focus on ethical investing, responsible scaling, and particularly topical issues in the technology sector as companies are faced with concerns about the treatment of their employees, customers, and communities, as well as the potential for harm from their products and services. We will explore trends in value-driven investments, the challenges faced by ethical companies and founders as they scale, new and emerging means of organizing and monetizing a business, and much more. I will begin by introducing our distinguished panelists and then lead us in a discussion for about 30 minutes, after which we'll take questions from the audience. If you have a question you'd like to ask our panelists during this session, please use Cvent's Q&A feature, which you will find on the right-hand side of your screen. We will devote time at the end of this session to answer these. So without further ado, we'll dive right in. So first up today, we have Dr. Brandeis Marshall. Dr. Marshall is an education activist, scholar, and data justice advocate. Originally trained as a computer scientist, her work sits at the intersection of data and AI ethics, data engineering, and culturally responsive pedagogy. She's the CEO of Data edX, a talent development firm advancing the data science capabilities of the everyday professional. Dr. Marshall regularly instructs, mentors, speaks, and studies the racial, gender, and socioeconomic impacts of data and technology. She's developing culturally responsive data resources as a 2021-22 practitioner fellow at Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab. And her first book, with an expected release next year, will cover the interlocking web of data, algorithms, and society. Dr. Marshall, thank you for being here. Next up, we have Sheila Musavi. Sheila leads strategy and operations at Boku, a technology consulting company that advocates for accessibility, inclusion, and justice on and through the web. Sheila's work focuses on cultivating effective, justice-oriented organizations and workspaces. And in her role at Boku, she leads the team in aligning business operations, strategy, policies, and practices within the company's mission and values. She also delivers strategic management support to Boku's customers and partners. Prior to Boku, Sheila had leadership positions in strategy and operations at nonprofit organizations focused on health equity and disability justice. She has an undergraduate degree in political science from Vassar College, where she studied social movements, and received her master's degree in international business with a focus on change management from École Supérieure de Commerce de Rennes. Next up, we're joined by Michaela Gregory. Michaela is the director of ESG services at NEI Investments, a Canadian asset manager. She's actively involved in NEI's corporate engagement work and spearheads dialogues with companies across a number of sectors, including tech, consumer staples, consumer discretionary, and pharmaceuticals. Prior to joining NEI, Michaela was based in Ghana with an impact investor focused on investment in early stage tech-enabled social enterprises in sub-Saharan Africa. She's a lawyer by trade, called to the bar in Ontario, Canada, and practiced plaintiff-side class actions law in Canada across various legal issues, including securities litigation, product liability, consumer protection, and price fixing issues. Michaela, thank you for being here. And last but not least, we're also joined by Lisa Khan. Lisa is the co-founder and COO of Icebreaker, a community engagement platform. She's held leadership roles at Facebook, the MIT Media Lab, and President Obama's campaign, and has consistently focused on healing societal divisions through community and technology. At Facebook, Lisa led the company's efforts to build products that reduce polarization and build empathy on the platform. At the Media Lab, she partnered with Twitter to create the Electome, which tracked the public response on social media to the 2016 US presidential election, described by Vice News as a treasure trove on how Americans discussed one of the most contentious presidential races in history. Lisa has led large-scale community organizing and has studied social movements at NYU, later earning her MBA at MIT. She's also been named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, and her work has been featured in numerous publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. Thank you all distinguished panelists for being here. That was an abbreviated version of everyone's bios. For those tuning in, the full bios are at Idea Week's website. But as you can tell, we are just really, really privileged to have this group assembled today. So without further ado, Michaela, I would love to start with you. So this panel is in part about ethical investing. So I'd like to turn to you for an investor perspective on what we mean by ethical investing. Specifically, if you could walk us through how you think about the relationship between ethical investing, technology ethics, human rights, and emerging notions of ESG, and also how those relationships may be evolving.
Well, it's great to be here with all of you again today, and thanks, Elizabeth, for inviting me. I think ethical investing, at least how we look at it at NEI Investments, really centers on thinking of an investment strategy that doesn't just consider for-profit motivations of businesses, but also looks to how businesses should be considering environmental, social, and governance issues as well. And I think for us, we do believe that in considering those issues, in considering all stakeholders to a business beyond just shareholders, that's actually laying the framework and the foundation for sustainable long-term value creation for the business. And so when we think about technology ethics and human rights, all of that is deeply ingrained into what it means to be thinking about ESG. Human rights are fundamental to our society, and businesses actually benefit from a stable society where civil rights and democracy are upheld. And in turn, we think that businesses have a role to play in ensuring that they are doing their part to uphold human rights. And as an investor, we also think that it's incumbent upon us to be able to show that we're also doing the work, to have those conversations with our investees and to feel confident about the processes and policies they have in place to identify, assess, and respond to any human rights issues. So specifically when it comes on to tech, then, of course, we know that from a traditional human rights issues lens, there are the supply chain issues that would be relevant within tech, just the way it would be in more traditional sectors. But then, of course, there's this added layer of digital rights and the evolution of tech and what that means for upholding democracy, for upholding civil rights, for thinking about privacy and surveillance. And all of that now is a very important feature of how we are looking at what a robust approach to environmental, social, and governance issues would look like. So in short, all these issues are connected, and our expectations of companies are evolving to meet those needs as well.
Thank you, Michaela. So many wonderfully rich points in there that I'd like to come back to in the course of this conversation. And I think particularly the notion of the evolving S in ESG is a really interesting one. One of the trends that we've seen right now is a controversy between companies who are trying to sort of do business without entering the realm of conversations about the socio-political, and other companies who are sort of actively embracing that as a feature and as a sort of an identity for the company. In that vein, I'd like to turn to Lisa next, if we could. So Lisa, I obviously want to talk about the incredible work that you're doing through your new ventures. But if we could, for a moment, picking up on the ESG thread, turn to some of your experience in the companies, particularly at Facebook. How do you view the relationship between things like technology ethics, ethical investing, human rights, and ESG? And how do you think those relationships need to evolve?
It's interesting that you sort of bring up this new trend. The latest is Basecamp is sort of prohibiting companies from talking about socioeconomic issues. Coinbase did this, gosh, it must have been about a month and a half ago. And interestingly, when I think about companies, and I can talk about Facebook specifically, there's the company itself, which is a community. There's the product itself and the people who use the product, the community that uses the product. And then of course, there's the business and the business model, and all of these things are really directly connected. You know, the one thing that's sort of interesting about Facebook is Facebook as a company has a version of Facebook called Workplace that's used by employees to communicate and to collaborate internally. And Facebook obviously also is a platform that billions of people use to interact and to engage. And the same sort of challenges that Facebook experienced as a platform, it also experienced as a company using this platform Workplace. And so I'll just sort of describe an example. One of, I think, the most amazing parts of Facebook is Facebook groups. And when I was doing research on what are the places where depolarization is happening on the platform, we found that it was within these communities that lived on Facebook groups. And these were communities that couldn't really exist elsewhere. For example, a Facebook group called Affected by Addiction Support Group. The purpose of this group is for people who are suffering from addiction to come together and support each other. Another example is Hike It Baby, a community of people who love hiking with their kids. And these are these really meaningful communities where people would come together and find purpose and belonging, etc. And what would happen in these groups is, while they weren't political in nature, inevitably political issues would come up because they're relevant. You know, the example of Hike It Baby, inevitably someone would post about how they can't hike in a place in California because of wildfires, and it would devolve into a conversation about climate change, for instance. And yet the leaders of these communities, who were often, they were volunteers, they were people who were sort of thrusted into these leadership positions without being prepared for it, were ill-equipped many times to actually facilitate and moderate the kinds of conversations that were taking place in the environment where they actually would be most effective, because people had something profound in common. We saw the same challenge on Workplace, Facebook's internal version of Facebook, where employees who are primarily fairly ideologically homogeneous in sort of reality, it's a lot of sort of elite, educated, liberal folks, mostly US based, would often in the sort of same vein come across challenges and be sort of ill-equipped to manage them. And so, what our company is sort of trying to do is to teach people how to have conversations, whether they're easy conversations like, what was your favorite cereal as a kid, or more challenging conversations like, how would you define your culture, and what is your power, what is your privilege, and how can you create a more equitable society or company? And our sort of hope is that the company that we are building, which right now is just 13 people, is reflective of those same values as the platform that we're building.
Thank you, Lisa. And I do want to get back to what you're building. But just for a moment, I'd love to turn to Sheila. Sheila, picking up on this question around sort of the relationship between business and socioeconomic and political issues. Bocoup is known to have very clear conviction and even take very political stances at times. For example, I'm familiar with the work you've done around eviction defense and related initiatives. Can you talk about how you view your role and the company's role in this conversation and in bridging the sort of controversy as between pursuing a for-profit venture and also taking a political stance?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me again. So I think there's a growing and frankly far overdue understanding that there's no such thing as neutral technology. Technology reflects the biases of everyone from the people who make it to the end user. It's subject to the same systemic injustices that are baked into every other aspect of our society. And as a result, what we often see is that it impacts the communities who use it. Often the people who are most impacted by the technology that's built are communities that are already marginalized by structural inequalities that we've baked in. And so for us, the option of being apolitical doesn't actually exist. I think it's a false notion that you can be apolitical, especially if you're engaging with technology. The problem in terms of my role that folks in any business face, regardless of their corporate form, regardless of their business model, and I have worked in both the nonprofit and the for-profit space, so I've seen this play out, is that because of the financial pressures that organizations face, and the limited options available in terms of funding, it's way too easy for business leaders to defer to the loudest and most prominent stakeholders that they have. And so part of what I see my role as being is making sure that we're intentionally diversifying our stakeholders such that we're not only focused on financial stakeholders like our clients, but also making sure that we're engaging community partners, engaging anybody who has a stake in the output of the work that we do. And part of what I see as the responsibility of anyone engaging with technology, and especially business leaders engaging with technology, is developing an explicit perspective on how they want their technology, their work to interact with the communities that use it, as well as the people who are working on it. I think that's something that often gets lost in this conversation. And then just as importantly, to build that perspective into their governance structures, into their budget, into every aspect of how they work, who they get input from, and how they compensate the people they get input from. That should all be part of this discussion. And from my perspective, the option of just not engaging with the political questions around the work just means that you're ignoring huge facets of the impact that your work is going to have on the people who use it. There's this, the Design Justice Network is a kind of collective that we admire heavily. And there's a principle that you always look to the people most directly impacted by your work to inform the design of that work. And that, from my perspective, needs to be baked into every aspect of how you approach it. And so that's kind of the lens that I bring into thinking about the relationship between the various forces that we're talking about here.
Thank you, Sheila. I really appreciate that perspective, and I think probably shared by many on this panel. Would love to turn to Dr. Marshall now, who is an activist doing incredible work in this regard in terms of the racial, gender, and socioeconomic impacts of technology, with a specific focus on data justice. So Dr. Marshall, I'd love to, for those who aren't familiar with the term, I'd love it if you could perhaps start with what you mean by data justice and why you feel it's such an important element to bring into this conversation.
Yes, and I'm kind of glad that I'm going last because everyone had such wonderful comments that I can like pick from and expound upon a little bit. So when it comes to data justice, for me, everything we're talking about kind of hits at all the symptoms of what we're really trying to get at when it comes to equity and impact and outcomes driven. To me, the root is really the data. It is how we're thinking about the data before it gets into the system, how we think about formulating the problem, how we're thinking about that data being stored, how we think about that data being analyzed and visualized, and then how it's being communicated. So when it comes to data justice, it's all about going back to this root of what is the data that we're talking about and how are we forming it? Because we already know, which was said before by several of the panelists, we already know that there's biases, and biases is a very loaded term now because there's many different types of biases. But I really want to just reinforce and emphasize this notion that at the root is how are we looking at and interpreting data. And that is therefore informing the algorithms, that is then developing and moving forward the tech. This is how organizations are able to build their products and their services and then receive their monies from their clients and from other corporations. So for me, data justice is really about trying to make sure that we are thinking equitably first and centering equity before we move forward in any of the other processes when it comes to handling that data and, of course, the data products.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. With that point, I think it makes sense to actually go back to Michaela, because I'd like to talk more about data in the context of business models. So I think one of the challenges we've seen, particularly with startups and new ventures, is a lack of clarity around what the business model will be, and an impulse to sort of collect and harvest as much data as possible in the event that another business model doesn't emerge. In your experience, can you tell us about perhaps how that trend might be changing and whether there are some more interesting business models that may be emerging apart from just the surveillance capitalist framework that we've all become quite used to?
Mm-hmm. I think there's so many interesting points to kind of bridge off of that question, Elizabeth. And I think maybe to start, it's first of all acknowledging that as an investor, many times we are actually, up until yesterday, with a small group of investors, we were having a very rich conversation about exactly the kinds of tensions that exist between certain tech business models and means of generating revenue, and how there can be friction with that model and the need to uphold human rights and what would be or could be ethical decision-making with respect to the use of certain technology. And so this is consistently coming up in my work and in the conversations that we're seeking to have with businesses. And we're seeing that beyond our group of like-minded investors, there are themes on this emanating within the broader business community, right? And so, for example, the UNGPs, which are the UN's guiding principles for human rights in business, there's a specific project in relation to the UNGPs called the Btec Project. And the Btec Project really speaks to the nature of bringing forward and implementing these guiding principles by tech companies. And one of the things that is flagged as a key focus area is exactly the tensions that exist in relation to business models. And I can say that in terms of our conversations that we seek to have with a number of tech players, this is the part that I think companies tend to shy away from with respect to their disclosures. And we're often seeking more acknowledgement about the fact that this tension does exist. And then following acknowledgement that it exists, how are companies actually working to deal with that tension, to grapple that tension? If we think about targeted advertisement, for example, how do you square up the fact that engagement on your platform is great for revenue with the fact that sometimes what you need to do is tone down that engagement by focusing on heightening your content moderation strategies and removing offensive material? And so I think it's important that companies are ready to have that conversation with a broad group of stakeholders.
Thank you, Michaela. Another thing that's good for engagement is polarization. So I'd like to turn back to Lisa to talk about some of the work you've done around polarization and how you think this question of business models comes into play and how you're thinking about them and starting a new venture.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what Michaela's saying really resonates with me because these are the exact conversations that I'm having with my co-founders and our investors. So we started our company about 2.5 years ago. It's just crazy. It sort of feels like just yesterday. And like all good startup stories, we started it in my living room in a small 1-bedroom in San Francisco. And I have 2 co-founders. And in that first conversation, it's a little bit like a marriage where you start by talking about your non-negotiables and the things that are important to you. And we went around and described sort of the things that are important to us. For my co-founder, Perry, being a remote company was important to him. And for me, one of the things that was essential was that we didn't have a business model that incentivized time spent on the platform. And what that meant, well, most obviously, and obviously I just come from Facebook, was I do not want a business model that is sort of a selling data and or advertising, although those are sort of the same thing. Because I had seen in my time at Facebook that there is a relationship between time spent on the platform and loneliness, and at times extremism and polarization. And so those things are certainly increase people's time spent on a platform. And if your business model requires more time spent on the platform, then you're going to increase that. And I actually don't think it is healthy for individuals to engage with technology all the time. And so we decided then that we would be a revenue kind of a SaaS business. Where we would charge the users of our platform for use of the platform. And then we sort of had to have conversations about, and we're still in the process of refining what exactly is our pricing structure and what's included in the pricing structure. We're still in that stage as a startup. But we knew we didn't want our business, we knew that it could be healthy for someone to use our platform once a day, once a week, once a month, depending on them and their situation. And if that's what's healthy for them, we can't have a business model that is in conflict with that. We can't have for example, our platform is sort of event-based. We chose right away not to have a model that was per event, because then we would be sort of incentivized to encourage people to have more and more and more events, which may or may not actually be healthy for them. And so at least as of now, we're a subscription business where you get unlimited access to the platform and you pay monthly. And so we are not kind of encouraging you to use the platform necessarily hourly or even necessarily daily. And our business model isn't kind of forcing that on our customers.
Thank you, Lisa. That's a breath of fresh air to hear about how you're approaching things. I think another refreshing approach, if we go back to Dr. Marshall, is the work that you're doing with Data edX. So I think one of the things you're really clearly demonstrating, at least to me, is that doing good and profit can coincide. And your emphasis on data justice while still growing a business is really inspiring. So I was hoping you might tell us a bit about how you decided to start this venture and how you're thinking about growth and business models while still pursuing these goals of data justice and equity.
Yes, there's a lot going on. So pursuing my own company, right? Data edX is really born out of my own frustration, which I think is the hallmark for a lot of different people. And my frustration is with the data science landscape of being the fact that I am a computer scientist by training. I'm noticing just the importance of data in so many different areas. And so I think it's important to change that narrative to make sure that it is welcoming and there's a sense of belonging for anybody. And so, of course, I want to center myself. I want to center Black womanhood inside of data spaces. I think that it's important that anytime that there is a conversation about data, that there are Black women at the table. And so Data edX is a company that's really looking at culturally responsive type of instructional design and resources, and to do it in a model that's more of a consultancy. So we've gone back and forth, me and my co-founder, about how do we do this, and then COVID hit, and then we had to rejigger in order to then move forward of what type of model we wanted to do. But right now we're a consultancy. We want to work directly with individuals, with companies who are looking to expand the data learning for their team members, because we really do believe that everybody touches data. So you are a data professional by proxy, and that means that you need to have a certain amount of understanding in order to effectively do your job. And then the benefit is that these data skills are going to be transferable to other positions or even to start your own company. So we really want to take this model of let's do consultancy for a while. We hopefully will be doing events, and we'll have a subscription type of model for people to get trainings on a regular basis. But I really do believe as an educator that in person, when we get back in person, is going to be very important to our business moving forward, to have those live events. But in the meantime, while we're virtual, to have virtual events, because learning how to do anything takes a personal approach. There's no way to automate that. And this is coming from a computer scientist with all those degrees. I'm saying technology is not good for learning. Like, you really do need to talk to people. And so that's part of our model, is really to make sure we center humanity, we center that equity. We want to make sure it's inclusive of all different demographics. So that's what DataX is all about. That's our model. We're not taking any investors because we want to be independent. We want to make sure that we are doing things according to our business plan, our business model, to really provide the best work possible to our customers.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. One of the things I'm hearing is around sort of a conscious effort to slow things down and to grow perhaps at a slower pace so as to preserve some really important core values. I think, Sheila, if I could turn to you, Bocoup really seems to embody this similar philosophy around perhaps growing more slowly, about pursuing different business models. I was hoping you might tell us a bit more about your community engagement and your philosophy of co-designing some of your projects and work with community members, and also about how you think about alternative business structures. For example, cooperatives come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, thinking about scaling, one of the ethical considerations I think we often bypass is this actually the right move at all? Should we be scaling? What's the speed at which we should be doing it? And I think there are a number of questions that we ask ourselves when we're trying to debate that. The first being, will growing allow us to do things that we can't currently do, especially those that align with our social justice mission and framework? And if the answer to that is yes, the next question is, do we have an ethical means of funding that growth? And related to that, how are we taking on clients? How are we vetting clients? And then finally, do we have the operational infrastructure to actually support the growth internally to make it feel okay for the team? Because I think often organizations think we'll just grow and everyone will come along and we'll figure it out as we go. But frankly, that's not the reality of how it plays out in a lot of people's lived experience. It can be a very scary experience. And so we are growing very slowly. And the way that we're thinking about that is in the context of there are some things that we want to be able to do in terms of just having more capacity on our team to engage with community partners. And so we want to bring in just enough capacity in terms of staff to do that effectively without ending up in a position where we have grown too quickly and now are just scrambling to fund our work and are having to take in funding that doesn't meet our criteria. In terms of alternate models, we've been exploring and researching a cooperative model. We kind of have a hypothesis that we're currently testing around that potentially being a way to build in more solidarity on the team. Obviously, I would not have agreed to this panel if I didn't believe that it is possible to scale ethically while making a profit. And at the same time, I recognize on a day-to-day basis, there are a number of decisions that have to be made where it seems like the business decisions are at odds with people's needs. And our kind of theory that we're testing now is if everyone on the team has a stake in both the business and obviously in their own personal well-being and the experience of doing the work, that we might be better at finding that balance. I don't think it's possible to completely negate some of the inequities that organizations face as a function of just how we've structured our financial system in the country. But I do think it's possible to get closer by creating a system where there are a greater number of stakeholders at different levels in the organization so that people are playing a role and it's not just a couple business leaders making decisions for everyone. In terms of engagement, there's a few parts to that question. So in terms of engagement with community partners and co-design, as I mentioned earlier, there's this design justice principle that you always engage with the people who are most directly impacted. So what that means is actually building into our scopes of work, into the design of our projects, a budget and time to identify and work with partners on the ground. And like I said earlier, if you're not proactively doing that up front, you will end up in a situation where you're rushing to get things done, and for the sake of efficiency, you just bypass that altogether. And that's something we're trying to combat. I will admit that we're still figuring all this out. We've by no means cracked the code, but those are some ways that we've started to engage with trying to both engage with co-design better and engage with our own team in a more ethical way.
Thank you, Sheila. I think the humility to acknowledge that these are difficult questions is an important part of the conversation and trying to move forward. We've heard so many really thoughtful approaches that you're taking as founders of ventures, of companies. I'd like to turn to Michaela. So we've got, no shortage of talent and character, and yet in 2020, only 2.3% of venture capital went to female founders, actually down from 2.8% in 2019 as women are really bearing the brunt of the pandemic. And an even tinier fraction of that went to women of color. So how can we talk about ethical investing without talking about these disparities in terms of resources? And how do you think ethical investors can help address some of the inequity and discrimination in access to capital going forward?
This is a big question. And I think from my perspective, we should be thinking about it in a very multifaceted way, in a very multi-pronged way, because it's a systemic issue that requires a very layered and deep solution in order for us to really see traction. From my perspective, I think maybe to articulate NEI investments and how we approach investing a little bit more, we are an asset manager, meaning then that most of the investees that we own are further along in their process from a growth perspective, or they're more mature companies. And we have found it to be very important at that stage to be encouraging and pushing for diversity and diverse representation at higher levels of the organization and on the board and throughout the workforce. And also then to be continuing to have these conversations with companies. So it's not just a matter of representation today, but also inclusion. And how are you prioritizing this as an issue for the business that is actually heard and understood and felt by the entire employee base because it's articulated by leadership. I think it's important that investors are pushing for that, are consistent with that push, and that the expectations of companies at that stage of the journey is clear. I think that's important because then when we move forward, when we move now into thinking about early stage ventures and when we start thinking about startups, you know, and switching my caps a bit to thinking of my former role with a more VC style impact investor, I think it's important that early stage investors have a sense of the expectations of later stage investors, right? And I think that pressure then will translate into a more robust thinking on diversity, equity, and inclusion at the VC stage as well. So that's one part of my thinking. I would also say for us, it has caused us, knowing that we're having these conversations with companies, it has caused us to look internally within ourselves and say, within our organization, what does diversity and inclusion look like? If we have these expectations of companies, then can we also walk the walk? And what are the things that we need to do differently, right, in order for us to be aligned with what we're saying? And I think as investors continue to have those conversations and as those expectations continue to be, you know, put out there and be made more clear, and as consumers actually demand that more, I'm hoping that we'll continue to see some positive change on that front. But that being said, that number is completely, it's entirely problematic to hear, and we have a long way to go.
Thank you, Michaela. Not an easy question by any means. Dr. Marshall, knowing your work, I was wondering if you wanted to jump in on this one as well.
I do. I have a couple of things, I guess a little bit of data to share as a data head. So American Express actually did a survey and about women in business, women-owned businesses back in 2019. I believe the 2020 version is out now. But I know for the 2019 version, Black women were the fastest growing women-owned businesses in the country. And so were all the other people of color. But Black women in particular were the fastest growing, but yet their annual sales was $24,000. So I'm gonna say that again. Black women were the fastest growing business owners in the country, but yet their annual sales were only $24,000. So I'm hopeful that there will be a disruption in the VC and investment world that will look at providing funds to startups of people of color, and particularly Black people, Native American, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, women-owned businesses that does not necessarily tie this notion of a percentage of their company or necessarily some type of investment, but looking at impact. What type of impact can be done with a partnership? And then moving forward from there. So instead of for providing $5,000, provide $50,000 and have some impact work in order to help grow that business. That's a different model. It does break all of the capitalist norms, but it's very apparent based upon the surveying that the traditional routes do not work for all of us. And therefore different routes and alternatives need to be had.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. That is a startling statistic. Still taking it in. I think at this point we have about 20 minutes remaining. And so as promised, I'd like to turn to some of the questions we're getting from the audience. Some of these are directed at particular panelists, others are not. So please feel free to jump in if something resonates. This one looks like it may be directed at Lisa. There's a question about social media and how social media, especially Facebook, has facilitated some really objectionable things. For example, with family separations at the border, and how there has been both mis and disinformation about political issues. There's a question here about how one can use these types of services on social media for things like marketing a business or other beneficial uses, while avoiding some of these negative, problematic associations.
Such an interesting question. I was just the other day, a friend got a job offer to work at Facebook, and on actually a small business team helping small businesses use their advertising products. And we had this exact conversation from the context of a potential employee. And I think just as it's challenging to be one part of a 50,000 person business that maybe is doing something really good, it's also challenging to use a platform, the part of the platform that is doing, I would say, objectively good, beneficial things while ignoring potential problems, because it's one system, it's one, it is the same platform that enables a small business to very cheaply target customers, that also then relies on data and time spent on a platform, which contributes to, or at least is maybe enhanced in some ways by a spread of disinformation or misinformation. And so I think it's really, really challenging. And that's one of the challenges for these companies themselves. They're not all bad. They're not all good either. There are incredible things that digital technologies enable, whether it's YouTube, which enables people to have access to education, but also maybe has this problem of radicalizing people. There's Twitter, which is incredible because it gives everyone a voice. If we remember in 2007, 2008, when Twitter first got big, it was incredible that anyone could have their megaphone and that organizing could take place and power dynamics could be flattened in some ways. But we're now starting to see, years later, some of the challenges with that. Same with Facebook. Facebook is an incredible platform that really enables small businesses to reach audiences. It also is an amazing platform. I was describing the Facebook groups. When I was meeting with the leaders of these Facebook groups, and the members of these communities, like, they would hug me and thank me because the community they were part of was just the most meaningful part of their lives. And so I think, I don't have a great answer to you. I just want to the person who's asked this question, I just want to sort of introduce the complexity. It's one ecosystem, it's one platform, and you kind of do have to take the good with the bad with the good. It's a challenge for people who work in these corners of these companies, and it's a challenge for consumers and users of these companies.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think there is a tension for a lot of people who are, genuinely trying to do good, but encountering a lot of the hurdles that you pointed out. There's a question here, perhaps not directed at anyone in particular, about how to compete against a company that is not doing things ethically. Anyone want to take that one?
Well,
go for it.
You have a couple of options. You can use your Twitter to call attention and be a very public whistleblower, knowing that there is consequences to doing that. As we have seen online, most recently, Dr. Tim Niguru is taking to task a very big tech organization that everyone knows I'm talking about. That was one option. The other option is to try to work internally. I know many people have tried to do that. That has its pros and cons as well, of how much you're able to move forces within an organization that is structurally trying to make you fit into a culture where you are trying to add to the culture. So that tension is very real. And then, of course, there's a third option, which is to leave and go to a different organization or create your own enterprise. So there are options, but it all is really rooted at your economic stability. Are you able to leave if you want to? if you're working within an organization, are you healthy enough in order to continue that work and not cause detriment to your own person? If you do things very vocally, do you have protections digitally or legally in order to make sure that you are protected and of course your loved ones are protected? So I just went through this like a laundry list of like all these different pros and cons. But I think, at least for myself, I've struggled with them in a number of different arenas. And I've known a lot of people that have struggled with them all. So take care of yourself is the best advice, is make sure that you are okay with whatever option that you choose.
Yeah, I think that's sage advice we can all take to heart. Another somewhat related question is about a lot of the VCs and companies promising big changes, including increased funding to minorities last summer. It looks like some of those promises have not entirely materialized. And so there's a question about who is holding them accountable, and how do we hold companies accountable for these kinds of promises? Who would like to jump in on this one?
I can jump in here, Elizabeth. One of the conversations that we're having internally right now is, just off of how stirred we all were in relation to diversity, inclusion, racial equity, and advocating for equity broadly for underrepresented persons last year. We saw that there was a lot of talk, right? And I think internally this year, the question then is, are companies actually following through on these commitments? And to the point raised in the question, I would also include VC funds, all levels of private actors, etc. Are the commitments that were stated actually being acted upon? And I think from an accountability perspective, I'd say part of that is recognizing what drove a lot of the statements to be released from the beginning. And I think that was a lot of pressure that was being felt from a reputational perspective on companies. And in our conversations, I would say that reputational risk, it really holds. It holds in terms of how companies evaluate their next steps going forward. It holds as they consider, the perspectives of their employees and whether or not their employees are happy with whether or not the policy that they stated actually lands as and is implemented as they thought it would be implemented. And I imagine that with some consistent effort on the part of, stakeholders who are committed to furthering these efforts, that we should see further dialogue coming from companies and potentially some companies being called out and VC funds being called out for not doing what they said they would.
So the power of public shaming, let's not underestimate. Yeah. It sounds like a theme that's come up more than once. There's an interesting question about equity and inclusion. So we've talked a lot about gender and racial equity. Another perhaps often overlooked dimension of this in the technology ethics conversation is around ableism and around accommodating disabilities. So, there is a new audio app known as Clubhouse that is just rumored to have a $4 billion valuation by Andreessen Horowitz. And the app was basically rolled out with zero accommodations for persons with visual or audio disabilities. Whereas competitors such as Twitter Spaces have made certain accommodations, things like transcripts and other features that enable more accessibility. Maybe I'll turn to Sheila first on this one, since I know you've done work around accessibility, both personally and through Bocoup, and how you view this piece of the conversation in the context of ethical investing and responsible scaling.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important question, and it's one that we grapple with a lot. I will say one thing in terms of also accountability from the last question. One way that organizations can keep themselves accountable is asking before they start a project, can we actually fund making sure that we're investing in accessibility upfront? Because I think a lot of people treat accessibility like you come in afterwards and you fix all the accessibility problems, when in fact it needs to be built in at the start. And there was a really great blog post that was actually written this week that I'll drop in the chat, or I'll somehow share.
We can post it for you.
Okay, great, thanks. Where they really address this point, where if you're going to be engaging with technology in any way, really if you're engaging with any form of good or service, you really need to be building into your budget, into your skills on the team, making sure that you have a plan for testing, for planning, for incorporating it at every stage. It's really just a non-negotiable. And unfortunately, it's been treated like a negotiable for far too long. And I think part of that is that it's easy for companies to overlook, in the sense that there's not a lot of pressure from a lot of their stakeholders to invest in this. It's not always immediately clear what the return on investment for them is. I'm sorry to be cynical, but I do think that's a big part of the issue here. And that's something that we each need to take responsibility for and work to address. I'll also say that there's a limitation in how we talk about accessibility, where it's often rooted in like one particular technology, like screen readers, for instance. And that is one that needs to be targeted, certainly. But the conversation is much broader than that and needs to be comprehensive. So this is another place where bringing in experts, bringing people with lived experience, hiring people with lived experience is a critical part of how we engage around digital accessibility, but any kind of accessibility.
One thing I do want to add to that one, I'm really happy that it came up, is we actually really early on, we had some basic, I think, accessibility details, closed captioning, that sort of thing. But it was certainly an area that we did not invest in at the time. We were 5 people. And so we had two customers, a large university and a really, really large tech company that actually required this as part of their uses of the product. And we were all actually quite pleased in a lot of ways that these companies were sort of standing up in this way. And so for those of you that are watching, you may not be a technologist, and you may be actually a person who is using vendors, and you have power to actually shape what is expected and what is required. You are an important stakeholder as well. And we experienced that firsthand.
And I just want to chime in and to say, there's something that you can do right now to make sure that the platform, since everything is technology based, there's something you can do in order to be more accessible, especially when it comes to text. When you do a hashtag, don't have it all lowercase. Capitalize the words, because when it goes through the algorithmic system, that pound sign goes away, and what's left is the text, and the uppercase is the trigger for the algorithm to know it's a new word. So then someone who is listening can therefore see that it was a hashtag and understand what that hashtag is. So that's just one thing you can do right now today, is make sure your hashtags actually have capitalizations for new words. It's just that simple.
Always good to have a computer scientist, data scientist on your panel to learn some hacks like that. Thank you, Dr. Marshall.
I have a ton of them.
Thank you so much.
Credit
Please.
The person that I was referencing, I just want to make sure, since I mentioned it, the article is called "Accessibility is More Than a Technical Problem," and it's by Devin Persing. And I just to add one more idea here, when we're thinking about these issues, it's very easy to defer to people who are adjacent to disability, who have thought about disability, who have family members with disabilities, but it is extremely important. This is probably the first thing I learned when I worked at a disability justice nonprofit many years ago. It is extremely important that you talk to self-advocates, people who have lived experience, because oftentimes you'll actually find that they have a very different perspective on what their needs are. Obviously, they don't speak for everyone with their disability, but they're some of the norms that we've come to expect as a society actually don't align with the preferences of a majority of self-advocates, and that's really important to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. Such excellent points. And thank you for sharing the resource. And we'll be sure to share it through our channels as well after the event. As we're coming up on about 5 minutes remaining here, perhaps we turn to a question with a more optimistic orientation. And maybe I'll turn to each of you for a brief response to this, which is, when you look around at the landscape, who do you think is doing things right, and what in particular about their approach gives you hope and optimism for the future?
I want to just say that one of the reasons that I wanted to be part of this conversation was to learn from Sheila. I'm so grateful to have learned from Akila and Brandeis. So my sort of initial thought is Boku, I think, is just doing incredible work, sort of balancing these sort of various challenges, both in terms of building an organization, which in my role, I think a lot about building technology and building a business model. And Akila and Brandeis, I learned so much from both of you today as well.
Thank you, Lisa.
I guess maybe just to jump in right here as well, I think something that you said, Lisa, actually really resonated in acknowledging that, tech isn't neutral, and also in acknowledging that it's not all good and all bad, right? I think that we should try and scale back from taking that kind of dichotomy of an approach, because I think that particularly when we look within industry, there are some things some companies are doing really well, even if they're not doing so well on other things. It could be that maybe from a disclosure perspective, they're more candid about some of the struggles that they're facing. It could be that they're actually prioritizing stakeholder engagement and making that a core part in terms of developing a strategy for managing and addressing human rights and tech ethics issues. And it could be that they see room for themselves in terms of actually facilitating industry movement. And so I think that's an important one. I think by and large, we see that a lot of these issues are evolving. And as an investor, what we really want to see is a genuine effort to know that you're prioritizing action in trying to address these issues, and that you're doing that in an informed way. And particularly with reference to a broad group of stakeholders and their interests.
Thank you, Michaela.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Lisa. And similarly, it's an honor to be here with all of you. I think, we can talk about all the things we're trying, but at the end of the day, we're trying. And I think there's a long, long way to go. Some of the people that we look to at Boku and admire, I mentioned the Design Justice Network, also the Algorithmic Justice League and the Processing Foundation are organizations that we look to often. At the end of the day, it's really just, I think, as Michaela said, just about prioritizing and putting in the effort. And I don't know that anyone has really perfected this. I would be really shocked if anyone was able to provide an example of someone who has. But I do think there are organizations that are clearly putting this at the forefront of their work and are grappling with the really hard questions of how do we balance our business imperatives and our people needs on a day-to-day basis.
Dr. Marshall, would you like to jump in?
Yes, I was trying to find the company, and the company that I look to, I recently met the founder, and it's Equity Meets Design. And it's a company that really tries to center equity in all type of design work and does it in collaboration and co-creation with their clients. And they have just really been an inspiration. I just met the founder a few weeks ago, and I've just been kind of digging into some of that work, and very inspired by how they marshal through very choppy waters But I would echo everyone else on the panel. It has been wonderful to hear everyone's perspective, to know that there is a community of people who are actually doing ethical work, centering equity and doing it with profit.